welcome to the Ipsos UK Politics Talk podcast. My name is Gideon. I'm the head of political research at Ipsos in the UK, and I'm joined by two of my colleagues from London, Cameron. Hi, Cameron.
Hi, Gideon.
And from our Manchester office, Holly. Hi, Holly.
Hi, Gideon.
So welcome to you two and to everybody listening. We're going to be discussing three things in yet another exciting month in politics in the UK and what Britons think of it all. We're going to look at the new leader in number 10. We're going to look at the new economic direction that the new leader and the new chancellor has announced at the autumn statement and what, if any, difference that seems to be making amongst the public. And then finally, we'll cover perhaps an older issue, but one that's coming back into the news, which is where the public is on immigration. If you enjoy our podcast, then please subscribe wherever you usually get your podcasts from. And look out for a bumper Ipsos politics and social affairs podcast in December. We'll have an hour-long special. We'll have some guests from outside Ipsos, and we'll take a look back at some of the most important events and trends and changes in public opinion over the year. So look out for that next month too. So for today's podcast, though, we're going to look at what's been happening over the last month and some of the changes in Westminster and how that's been received by the public. Before we get into that, I'm going to ask both Cameron and Holly just for their favourite stat over the last few weeks that they've picked up on in our polling. Holly, what stood out for you?
First of all, I'd say the extent to which things have kind of calmed down somewhat, which isn't a particular stat. It's more a trend in a direction. But we had a couple of months actually, where every poll we conducted, we were getting record numbers. In some cases, in trends we'd be collecting over kind of 20, 30, 40 years. In terms, though, of particular things that stand out, I think the fact that the Sunak government and his own personal ratings, he started at a very similar point to where Johnson began at the start of his premiership. So I'm going to be interested to see which direction he goes in. Historically, the starting point is the high point. Boris Johnson did buck that trend, though, and given they're starting from the same point, it'll be interesting to see if he can kind of replicate what his predecessor did at this point.
That's right. No, I think certainly some of the things that haven't changed this month are as interesting as some of the things that have changed. Cameron, what stood out for you?
Yeah, you've stolen my point, Gideon. I think it's interesting what hasn't changed this month, and especially looking at voting intention. Even though we've seen a change in government and leader, the fact that voting intention actually hasn't changed. So Liz Truss, under her government, Labour had a 21-point lead, and even though we've seen these changes, and Sunak's personal ratings have upped a bit, and there's been some fluctuations positive for Labour, that voting intention has stayed at a 21-point lead under Sunak's government too, I think is interesting, and might concern some people about how entrenched the damage to the Conservative brand is and what recovery they're going to need.
Yep, you're absolutely right. We'll get into that maybe if we talk about some of the reaction to some of the political events over the last few weeks. I liked some of the findings from our question that talked about whether you like the party leaders and whether you like the parties. I think the difference in views, both for Labour and the Conservatives, in terms of the different attitudes and the opposing kind of narrative and findings for both Conservatives and the Labour. So for the Conservatives, we have about a quarter of people saying they like Rishi Sunak, but they don't like the Conservative Party. And it's almost exactly the opposite for Labour. So we have 21% of people saying they don't like Keir Starmer, but they do like the Labour Party. And I think that's it's a good illustration of where both those parties are and maybe the strengths and weaknesses of each. But let's get into the leaders and the parties. And let's start with the new resident at number 10, Rishi Sunak, who's beginning with some both good and some bad news in terms of his first numbers in our trackers from our political monitor and other polls. As you said, Holly, it's always a kind of a question of where people go from their start. That's the key, and we'll have to see how it develops. But we can make some historical comparisons for Rishi Sunak. And some of them are reasonable for him. He's reasonably well liked. So 47% say that they like him personally, and that's above Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson scores earlier this year, certainly. It's above Keir Starmer's likability scores. In terms of whether people think he has what it takes to be a good prime minister, we've seen an improvement in that too. That went up 7 points to 42% and went up even higher amongst his own party supporters. So 8 in 10, 78% of people amongst Conservative supporters think he has what it takes to be a good prime minister. And that's up a lot from where he was over the summer at the time of the leadership election. So it seems as if there's some signs that just sort of taking the trappings of office is a benefit for him. He's looking more prime ministerial now. He's actually there. And what he's also done is he's overtaken Keir Starmer on a few measures. So he's ahead of Keir Starmer in the head-to-head score on who's the most capable prime minister, when it was important to remember that kind of Keir Starmer had turned around years of Labour being behind on this measure. Since the end of 2021, he'd been ahead of both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss on that measure. So his ratings are still a bit lukewarm, but Rishi Sunak has taken a marginal lead on that. And I think you were looking at Keir Starmer's ratings in a bit more detail, Cameron.
Yep. So comparatively, opinion remains quite divided on Keir Starmer. We've got 42% dissatisfied, 36% satisfied. So he gets a net rating of -6 if you do the maths. That's better on average than most leader of the oppositions. When we look across 40 years, the average is about -10, -12, something like that. But that's not saying much when you consider most of them go on to lose. And when you actually compare where Keir Starmer is to where Tony Blair or David Cameron were at this stage, he is behind. They were both in positives by now. So he kind of is at a bit of a crossroads on -6. Cameron was in a similar position around 2008 and managed to kind of turn around and get into the negatives by using the financial crisis as kind of a launching pad for him. And it'll be interesting to see whether Starmer can do the same about some of the economic trouble we're going through. You can see them trying to, but he hasn't really broken out into positives yet. And then under Truss, the majority of people said that Starmer was likely to become prime minister, and that has dipped a bit now Sunak has taken over. We're seeing about 46% saying he's likely to become PM. But when we compare that to where we were at the start of the year, we were at 28% saying he's likely to become PM. So there has been a sea change kind of in how people are perceiving him, but it's not necessarily cutting through into his ratings at the minute. But that's not to say they're bad. They're just kind of lukewarm.
Yes, I mean, you can certainly see, as you say, there's sort of the two things there. One, that Labour are a long way ahead from where they were at the beginning of the year, and indeed where we've seen them for much of the time over the last decade. But maybe the period under Liz Truss was a bit of an extreme period, and he can't quite replicate that, particularly when Sunak comes across as better on certain attributes. So he's perhaps not surprisingly, Sunak comes across as having a bit of a lead on the economy in terms of being more trusted on the economy over Keir Starmer. But he's also had on a few other more detailed issues as well, isn't he, Holly?
Yeah, and I think this is where Keir Starmer potentially runs into, a new challenge with Rishi Sunak in office. This is obviously not the first prime minister he's had to go up against, but each prime minister he does go up against presents him with a completely new challenge. So Sunak is actually ahead of Starmer on a few of the measures that we collect in terms of images of party leaders. So attention to detail, Rishi Sunak's got a 7-point lead there, although they're both high scorers, as you would expect on that particular one. Being good in a crisis, again, Sunak's leading that one by 14 points. I think that one particularly is pretty unsurprising, given the fact, I suppose, he was tested in his time as Chancellor through the coronavirus pandemic. So he's had something to prove himself on there, where it's a bit trickier to do, to prove yourself in times of crisis as leader of the opposition. But but also on having a personality. Rishi Sunak leads 6 points on that one as well, and that has been a criticism that's been aimed at Keir Starmer since he became leader of the opposition. So there are a few measures where the Conservatives have taken the lead with their new leader, where they perhaps weren't ahead when he was facing Liz Truss. So a bit of a different type of challenge. He is still ahead on some of the other measures though. So things to do with kind of being in touch with ordinary people, big lead there. So Starmer leads Sunak by 30 points. Being honest, again, leading by 8 points, and sharing the values of people by 11 points. So there are still measures that he's strong on, and still measures that he's seen as kind of very strong on comparatively versus Rishi Sunak. But Sunak presents him with the different challenges on some of the things that he himself has been seen as strong on versus the previous leaders of the Conservative Party.
Yes, you're right. And again, I think some of that, as you say, points to maybe some of the lukewarm weightings that Starmer has been receiving, but also that it's not all going entirely in Sunak's direction. And also going back to your earlier point about maybe we might expect things to calm down a little bit, or at least hope we might hope that things might calm down a little bit for our sakes, if no one else's. Sunak is much more, the public thinks that Sunak is much more likely to unite the Conservative Party than either Liz Truss or Boris Johnson did earlier this year. So 28% thought that Boris Johnson would unite the Conservative Party, even fewer, 14% thought that Liz Truss would unite the Conservative Party, but that's gone up to 42% for Rishi Sunak. So maybe people think that he's going to, as you say, calm things down a little bit, even if most people are still pretty doubtful that he's actually going to win the next election. But and that sort of brings us on to the fact that although his personal ratings in terms of how liked he is and overtaking Starmer on some image ratings are quite good, it's not all good news for Rishi Sunak. If we, for example, look at our kind of regular monthly question on whether you're satisfied or dissatisfied with the job that he's doing as Prime Minister, which we've been asking since the 70s, he's actually starting off on negative net ratings on that, even though of course many people are still to make up their mind about him, and that's very similar really to a position that Boris Johnson was in. So there's still time for that to change, but you compare that to other midterm prime ministers like Theresa May, Gordon Brown, and John Major, who took over without an election. They all started with kind of much bigger, much more positive views as prime minister when they started off with. And the other, I suppose, big challenge facing Rishi Sunak is that we know it's not just about kind of the personality of the leader, important though that is. It's also about delivery and party image, and that's where the real challenge lies for the Conservatives. If, for example, we look at how satisfied people are with the way that the government's doing its job, although that's marginally improved this month for the Conservatives, it's still pretty negative. Around 3 in 4 people are still dissatisfied with the government, and that's very similar to, again, how Liz Truss started and how Boris Johnson started, and much lower than, it's much worse than the average position, the average satisfaction rating for a government. I don't think we've ever seen any prime minister start with a worse satisfaction rating. And the other thing again on that one is it's a measure that hasn't really changed very much. It didn't change very much for Liz Truss, and it hasn't really seen much sign of getting better for Rishi Sunak, which ties into the overall perceptions of the Conservative Party. So as I mentioned, even though Rishi Sunak is relatively liked, that hasn't rubbed off on the party itself. If anything, that's got slightly worse. Only a quarter of people say they like the Conservatives, which is the lowest we've seen since we've started asking the question 15 years ago, actually. And that's kind of, that aspect has clearly got to be the worry for the Conservatives. Rishi Sunak is reasonably well perceived, but it's not rubbing off into much of a honeymoon for the Conservatives in terms of their wider image, or, as you said, Cameron, at the beginning, in terms of their voting intentions. And probably a big part of that is concern about the economy, which we know is kind of a key issue, was presenting Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak with a difficult legacy as they were appointed, but one that they were trying to turn around with the autumn statement. And sort of how successful have they been on that so far, Cameron?
So it's pretty bleak news. I don't want to depress everyone with the economy. So just before the autumn statement, we had 9 in 10 people saying that they'd describe the economy as poor, and only 7% who would say it was good. So these are really scraping the barrel figures low, and people aren't expecting like a snap recovery. So our economic optimism index shows that 7 in 10 expect it to get worse over the next year, which matches levels of economic pessimism last seen in 2008. So it's really low. And people throughout the year, since the start of the year, they've been telling us that inflation is the most important problem facing the country. And now that's starting to broaden out. So this month, the top issue facing the country was just the economy in general. So people are paying attention, and it is broadening out. They have a big challenge. And the budget, our Snap polling showed that people have been left feeling more concerned than reassured about Britain's economy, about their public services, and about their own personal financial situation. So it's not really been a fix-all, cure-all budget, which we've kind of seen reflected in the media as well. Some of the media have been a bit harsher to the budget than they would traditionally be towards a Conservative budget. But they had a challenge. So pre-budget, the public told us when we offered them like a menu of policies that they would be in favour of taxing energy companies, higher earners, freezing thresholds for high tax, and freezing foreign aid at 0.5%. Whereas they were against kind of the wider reaching revenue raising policies, which would have been like council tax, VAT, getting rid of the pension triple lock. So they had a challenge going into it. The ones that were going to raise lots of money, the public were already against.
And also, I think that there was little consensus around, tax rises or cuts to public services. It just doesn't seem as if the public are very keen on either of those options right now.
Yep, for sure. They don't really know what they want. In our polling, which we did with Deloitte on their state of the state, when we asked them whether they wanted higher taxes and higher spending, or lower taxes, lower spending, the public opinion was completely split, which was interesting.
And probably reflects concerns about the economy and cost of living. People aren't particularly looking forward to big increases in tax rises, but they're also very worried about public services. We know going into winter that 3 in 4 people are still think that waiting times in the NHS are too long. For example, and obviously people are going to be concerned about pay for public sector workers too.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And obviously this is all, there's the broad political interest in narrative about how this is affecting politics, but then also this is having a real personal impact on people. So we had some polling with Sky which showed that 3 in 5 haven't turned their heating on when they usually would have. People are switching supermarkets. 1 in 5 are skipping their meals. So this is having a real life impact, and the Conservatives are starting to be blamed for this. So the public are understanding when the Prime Minister comes out and says, oh, but we're in a tough global financial situation. The public understand that and attribute some of the blame to that, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine and COVID. But the Conservatives are increasingly starting to get the finger pointed at as well. And our latest political monitor showed that they're not just blaming the mini budget under Liz Truss, but that's actually broadened out as well to the past 12 years of economic policy from the Conservatives, which is a real worry for them.
And where's that leaving, as you said, the sort of the political implications? Is there much sign that that's either that's changing confidence in the Conservatives at all on the economy, and whereabouts are Labour on all of this?
So Labour are quite happily benefiting from all of this. So when we've asked for a few decades now who the most capable Chancellor would be, and for the first time since 2013, a Labour shadow Chancellor has the lead. Rachel Reeves, 35%, said she would be the most capable compared to 29% saying Jeremy Hunt. So the last time Labour were ahead was under Ed Balls. They are more the Labour Party are more trusted on the cost of living, public services by a long stretch. They had their first lead on the best economic policies since before the financial crisis. So they're really pulling ahead on this. But you're not seeing massive upticks necessarily in the percentage saying yes, they love Labour on this policy. It's more the drop in Conservatives. So there is signs for recovery there. And kind of what we touched upon earlier about Rishi Sunak's personal ratings, when you take the parties out of the picture and ask them, do you trust Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak on it? Rishi Sunak actually has an ever slight lead over Keir Starmer on the economy. So that's a glimmer of light for them. He's probably showing off his credentials as a previous chancellor, and it's to what extent he can build on that to help rebuild the Conservative brand more broadly.
And there's probably scope for the Conservatives, perhaps if they can reframe it more about the economy and growth in the economy than about reducing the cost of living or about public services. The race is tighter if it's about broader economic management, even though the Conservatives are still there's still probably some way from where they'd hope to be in terms of having clear leads on it, but at least the race is tighter on that than on the very personal cost of living one, or of course on public services, which would be a traditional Labour lead anyway.
Yeah, and Labour were definitely trying to fight on that front before Liz Truss. We had Keir Starmer making lots of mention of growth, we're the party of growth, this is our growth plan, etc. They were kind of battling out of that, weren't they? And yeah, the Conservatives will want to be picking up that mantle again.
Yeah, and I think probably we haven't seen much change after the statement. It's still it hasn't led to a big increase in confidence in the Conservative Party, as you say. Not clear that it's necessarily led to a big change for Labour so far. Yeah, we need to see how that has all played out, but it's all against a backdrop of very high levels of concern about the economy for all the different reasons that you've laid out, and maybe given that, it's not that surprising that it's going to take quite a long time to reassure people that things really are going to get better, particularly when we can see some of the economic data and some of the economic announcements from the OBR and others that are not terribly optimistic for the real state of the economy either. So I think you're right. The economy is going to be at the root of much of the political conversation and the political debate. And for the Conservatives to demonstrate that they're improving matters and they can kind of pick the economy up again, but also for Labour, as we saw in Keir Starmer's speech the other day, to demonstrate and to persuade people that they can be trusted on the wider economy. But it's not just going to be about the economy over the next couple of years. We know it's of course going to be about public services, and another issue that's been having more focus amongst the media, but also seems to be growing in importance. Some signs of it growing importance amongst the public as well, particularly amongst Conservative voters, is immigration. And we've done a number of reports on this over the last few months, looking at both long-term views and changes in Britain's views towards immigration, but also some of the sort of the political implications and which of the parties are more trusted on immigration. And you've been looking at that, Holly.
Yeah. So it's been an issue that's been across, I guess, the front pages a lot in recent weeks, recent months, and our issues index that tracks what people think is the most important issue facing the country on a monthly basis has immigration now at joint third behind the economy and inflation, as Cameron outlined earlier. It's actually on a par with the NHS, which I was quite surprised about. So selected by 21% of people, and that's seen a rise of a few points since last month, so since October, and it's overtaken issues such as the environment, which had been rising up the ranks a bit, and a lack of faith and lack of trust in politics and politicians as well. So it is climbing the ranks again, and it reached a high point back in 2015, obviously before the Brexit election, when it was consistently one of the top issues that was on the top of people's minds, then steadily decreased to a low of about 5% before the 2019 general election. So there were many issues that were kind of more at the forefront of people's minds. But since the start of the year, it's been climbing up our issues index, and there's been quite a sharp increase in recent months as well. And it's something that we have been tracking over longer periods. So there have been some interesting debates this week with Rishi Sunak at the CBI talking to business, who were raising kind of issues and questions about labour shortages in certain industries. The Prime Minister was countering those points, wanting to discuss illegal migration. And we've run a study with British Future since 2015, tracking public opinion on issues surrounding immigration. And our most recent data that we collected actually showed quite a nuanced picture. So it's not that straightforward. For example, the public aren't looking for increases in overall numbers by any stretch of the imagination, but when you ask them specifically about certain measures that can be implemented, particularly on labour shortages, they do support things like allowing workers from overseas to come in and fill shortages in sectors including doctors, including nurses, but also including people like care workers and seasonal fruit and veg pickers, which maybe you wouldn't expect to be in the positive in the same way that some of those other job roles are. Obviously, channel crossings as well have been in the news over the past few months. It feels like that kind of comes around on a bit of a cyclical basis. We gathered this data in the summer, so before kind of the recent news stories, but there is a dissatisfaction overall with the numbers of people that are crossing the channel, but also people have sympathy with the refugees that are making that journey. So it's not a straightforward picture, and that makes it really tricky for any Prime Minister, any government and any Home Secretary to make big decisions on this that are going to please either the entire country or even their own supporters that they're struggling with as well at the moment.
And clearly different emphasis placed on it by, as you say, by different party supporters. So it seems to be much more of an important issue for Conservative supporters than it is for Labour supporters as a priority. But Conservative supporters aren't particularly happy with their government's approach, but then they would probably be even less happy with Labour policy on it as well. So not an easy situation for either party. So where are the parties in terms of trust on immigration and immigration policies and migrants?
Yeah, we released some data this week actually on that, showing that Labour are currently more trusted than the Conservatives to have the right policies on immigration, on asylum seekers, and the handling of migrants crossing the channel. It's worth saying it's hardly an overwhelming lead for either party. The majority actually trust neither party on these issues, which should probably worry them both. But the trend here is that the Conservatives are currently trusted even less so than Labour on an issue that they kind of historically have kind of tried to have ownership of, and gain a reputation of being able to be trusted and being able to deliver and kind of have strength of messaging on as well. 35% of people trust Labour to have the right immigration policies versus just 20% the Conservatives. So that's quite a big difference. On asylum seekers as well, there's a 15-point difference. And on the migrant crossings, the handling of that issue, a third trust Labour on that and only 18% of Conservatives. And given that's such a big issue, it's kind of embedded in the news cycle at the moment to have only 18% of people trust you on that, and even more concerningly so have your own 2019 Conservative voters not trust you on the big issues of the day. I think it makes difficult reading for the government on some of these measures.
And not kind of perfect scores for the Home Secretary either. I mean, about half of people think that she's doing a bad job, and again, even among her own party supporters, they're not kind of hugely enamoured with her. They're pretty split. They're not fully behind her. But again, I think that sort of, as we said before, I doubt those Conservative supporters particularly would want a Labour style approach to it either. But it is definitely a tricky decision, and it's something that's been a concern for the Conservatives for a while. I mean, again, probably we could say similarly to the economy if we've been talking about that as well. Boris Johnson and Priti Patel's ratings on immigration were pretty low as well, again amongst their own supporters too. So it's not been an easy nut for them to crack, for them to deliver on. Against this backdrop of sort of changing public perceptions on immigration for some time. And it probably just goes into that great big mix of everything, that's all those difficult decisions that Jeremy Hunt has talked about, but that he and Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman and all the other Conservative government ministers are trying to deliver on, whether that's levelling up or health or other public services too. and helps to explain why they're suffering a bit in the polls, but also delivering on those or perceptions of failing to deliver on those, and maybe feeding through into wider attitudes towards politics. I mean, we've also seen a slight increase in sort of lack of faith in politicians in our issues index, and indeed in our long-running veracity index, which asks about a whole load of different professions whether you'd trust them to tell the truth or not. Now, politicians and government ministers are always at the bottom of that list, so it would be naive to pretend there was ever some sort of golden age of trust in politicians, certainly over the last few decades. But what we have seen is a fall this year in trust in politicians to tell the truth, back to levels that we last saw during the expenses scandal, after the expenses scandal in 2009, which again just goes to show how tricky a situation it is for the Conservatives, but also with Labour facing their own questions too. Although kind of generally you'd expect that they'll be feeling much happier going into December and Christmas than the Conservatives. So thank you very much for that, Holly and Cameron. I should say that in that veracity index, pollsters come about halfway in terms of being trusted by half the public, but I'm sure that hopefully includes most of the people listening to the podcast. Even if we're behind some of the new entrants to the veracity index this year, like serving staff at restaurants, taxi drivers, and car mechanics, but we shall do our best to climb up that league. So thank you both. Thank you everybody for listening. As I said at the beginning, this is Ipsos's Politics Talk podcast, and if you enjoyed it, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from, and otherwise look out for our bumper December edition where we will cover politics, but also wider current affairs and social issues and public issues around public services that we've been looking at and tracking over the last year, something to get you through the recovery from your Christmas dinners. But thanks again, and goodbye. We'll speak to you soon.